For the last 20 years, I sort of labored really, really hard to be a novelist, and I had a lot of success. I have several different books out, and then it got to a point where I was turning 40, and I was really like, books take a long time to get done. Like a novel can take 2 years to write, and then you got to find a publisher, and it takes the publisher 3 years to put it out, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I really just need something really immediate, like that I'm in control of, and that, I can paint a picture and put it on Facebook and it's done, right? There's no editor, there's no nothing. And so I went back to painting, which I had done a lot of in my youth through high school and college. And I was a totally different painter when I went back to it. And I think it relates to my years as a novelist. I'm always just kind of trying to tell a story, and I like it to be a story that's a little bit mysterious. Something that was a thread in my writing was, when people would come to my readings, they would say, well, why did they do this? Or, I didn't really get that scene because I think it could have meant this, but it could also mean this. And to me, those were like the best moments as a writer, that people were so engrossed that they would start to use themselves and put their own lives in it. And I think that's what I've been trying to accomplish with some of the paintings, that you really get the feeling like that you've kind of walked into them like in the middle of the action, like something definitely happened beforehand and something is definitely going to happen afterwards. And that's that moment that I like to grab, and I think I can really attribute that to being a writer. Some of the other things about it, clearly I have a love of nature. And when you think of nature and birds, let's see, just nature and bird paintings. Who do you automatically think of, like from America and history?
Audubon.
Yeah, John Audubon. And so I have a love-hate relationship with John Audubon. But he was really a painter who brought this idea of drama to nature paintings, because back then it was a very static process. People would kill the birds, they'd mount the birds, and then they'd put them in these sort of, so they could draw them. And John Audubon was really a person who would go out into nature. He'd take these long hikes through nature and observe nature. And they're really, if you look at John Audubon's paintings, there's a lot of drama between snakes and birds. They're natural enemies in a way. They eat each other's young. They're always kind of protecting or sneaking up on each other. And so I like that storytelling, the way that John told those stories. Now, I always have to acknowledge when I talk about John Audubon that he was an awful person. he was beyond the pale awful person. You sort of say, well, you judge people by their historical context, and he was a man of his day. And John Audubon certainly lived in a day in which there were a lot of abolitionists fomenting for the end of slavery. He could have made that choice. He could have seen that choice. But John Audubon was vociferously pro-slavery. And he did a lot of lectures and talks with leading scientists of the day in support of slavery based on his theories of nature and how some people are more superior than others. And you can find in John's diary, he tells this touching story about how he was lost in the woods and on the verge of death. And an escaped slave family took him in and fed him and helped him. And he repaid them by turning them back into their masters. He kind of turns it into a joke that he tells in his diaries. So I always have to say that. I think we live in a world where we can acknowledge that, right? That John Audubon is inherently one of my influences, but I also want people to know that, everybody has good and bad about them, and he had quite a bit of bad. But I have loved his paintings since I was a child, and it wasn't, I kind of pictured him as like the Huck Finn of American painting, out there wandering in the woods, and he was. And so a lot of that childhood love of his paintings comes through. And then there's the eyeballs, which my brother describes as my own just being really weird. Older brothers have really great art critiques that you can follow through on, but it is a theme, particularly in the nature paintings. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to convey to wrap this talk up back kind of where I started is sort of the mystery of nature. And we have this idea of ourselves observing nature, right? Us as the humans, we're observing wild nature. We're, observing like John Audubon. We're observing and we're killing and we're dissecting and we're understanding and applying science. And we do have this sort of view of us looking at nature, and I'm really trying to convey that nature knows us as well, and it's looking back at us and having thoughts about us that we'll never know about or understand. And there's a mystery to that I like to preserve and convey. So I think, Molly, does that work for a talk? That's kind of the things I like to say. I'm open to any questions. Obviously, I like a lot of color. Yeah. Any questions?
Curious about just compositions. Do you kind of have an idea going into a painting of like particular animals that you want to include in the painting, or?
Well, usually birds and snakes.
Sure.
There's a lot of them. Yeah, I'm not a, maybe it's back to that. I chose, with the writing, I'm still writing, but I chose to do this because it's more immediate.
Sure.
And I just don't like to suffer. There are painters, and I admire them so much, who, they draw things out and they diagram it. And, if you were to x-ray their paintings, you can see all the different layers and the ways they've attempted to do that. You'll see none of that with my paintings. To me, it's just kind of joy and being free to work. Normally I'll start with the flowers. I really like to start with the flowers. And I guess one thing I could mention is that you'll notice there's sort of like particularly you can see there's sort of a randomness to the colors and the backgrounds. You can see that on all of them. And that's because each of my paintings starts out as a full abstract painting. I get that background to look like I want it, with all different colors. And I'll paint several, like a dozen backgrounds all at once, so it's not really connected to the end product. And I kind of like the way, and then on top of that, I'll start to draw with paint marker or marker what I want on it. But I sort of like the way that the abstraction kind of adds this randomness to the background. It's kind of exciting to me. Like, you know, I can look at the painting too, and I know what I've drawn on it. But to me, sometimes the background is a little bit of a surprise for me too. Like, I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. I didn't notice that ended up there. This picture just around the corner, there's a little red dot there, and I was like, oh wow, that kind of looks like a heart in the middle of this picture. And you know, I didn't consciously put that there. You know, it's sort of, I allow the background to tell its own story as well, while I'm kind of sketching what I want on top. So,
Cool.
yeah.
When you talk about nature, just star giants, we're supposed to have northern lights.
Yeah, right. I wanted that wonder there, you know, and kind of the fairy tales about it. You know, the way nature, you know, to make nature kind of mysterious, yeah. And the star giants. There's a little bit, you can see, I draw these little chairs sometimes in my skies, and that's from a fairy tale that I loved as a child. East of the sun, west of the moon. There's a little girl, and she's searching for her brothers, but when she goes to visit the stars for advice, they're just women sitting in these silver chairs. And I've never been able to shake that. Oh, the silver chairs. So I think some people are like, well, that's a little weird. But that's personally the very personal link. And again, I don't mind putting those things in the paintings. I think people can be like, oh, what's the chair about? And kind of wander to themselves. Yeah.
So what do you think are like the bigger differences between your earlier paintings that you used to do in your youth and like the paintings you do now?
Yeah, it was the sort of lack of story. I think I would be was more focused on the actual image and how to create it and how to draw it in a certain way, and the perspective. You know, it was more technically focused, and now it's just a much looser process, you know. And I think I didn't have the imagination then, you know, like I didn't have the built up kind of psyche, you know, kind of you know, living a life and friends and family and jobs and deaths, you know, there's, you know, I'm coming back at it after having lived a whole life, you know. We were talking a little earlier about being an empty nester, and yeah, right? You're bringing all of that, all those years back to it, right?
Are you always working in acrylic or have you tried others?
I always work in acrylic because I'm impatient and it dries very fast. And I have tried working in other mediums, and because of my impatience, I tend to smear it and ruin it. So it's a very practical choice. It dries fast enough for me. So other things are prettier. Gouache has just got this beautiful light to it, but it's just dries too slow. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks.
Thanks.